Claudia Olivetti is an associate professor of economics at Boston College and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. She earned her MA and PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania, and her research brings an international perspective to issues such as female participation in the labor force and the relationship of labor force participation to marriage. She's done pioneering work examining gender inequality in pay that was highlighted recently by Pope. Her work wasn't highlighted recently by Pope Francis, but the gender inequalities were. Not yet, but in addition to, she's also done work on intergenerational mobility and the social implications of dramatic gains in maternal health over the course of the 20th century. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed panel as we discuss marriage.
And so let me go into the presentation. So Valerie, yesterday, you will hear a little bit of repetition because some of the themes that have emerged during the discussion, I mean, they're there. But hopefully I'll give you some extra information that might be useful in having a big picture about the marriage and divorce, actually. So, as Valerie, as Flavio, I'm a nervous presenter, and this is even more nervous. So I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. Okay, so as Valerie has articulated yesterday quite eloquently, the reason why economists are interested in marriage decisions is that because in general, we're interested about how individuals make decisions, what are the consequences of those decisions for the individual as well as the society, and as well as what is the impact in turn, what is the feedback between this decision of the individual on the aggregate economy, but also, going from the aggregate economy into people's decision. And marriage is one of the most important decisions, particularly because it has been proven over and over during the conversation over the past few days. Marriage is associated with financial stability, better outcomes on the labor market, better health outcome, and above all, as we just saw in the discussion in the morning, it is associated with better outcome for the children. Okay, so for this discussion, I'm going to really not refer very much to the value of marriage. But I'll focus on, for now, for most of the facts that I'll show you, on why do we study, why economics, what are the economic motivation of marriage. So since the seminal work by Gary Becker, who was a professor at the University of Chicago, marriage, one of the main motivation proposed for thinking about marriage in economic terms is that marriage, is the idea of a division of labor. Okay, so women might have a comparative advantage. So because of both biological and factor that are related to how the economic production is organized in the overall economy, we might be in a situation where women have a comparative advantage in staying home, and then so there are gains, as we say, from men and women in specializing in production. This separate sphere. The men are at work on the market, the women are at home. However, over the past century or so, because of the development in the economic environment, especially with the development of the service sector, a sector in which many women work, and other technological changes that have somewhat reduced women's comparative advantage, and there has been a trend towards decreasing gains to specialization, and therefore, in a sense, this very basic reason why we study marriage has become somewhat less fundamental as the economy has shifted away from the traditional family in which the male is a breadwinner and the woman works at home, to a more kind of modern marriage of equal, as also emphasized by, actually the other day by Pope Francis, okay? But there are other reasons why economic motivation for marriage, one being economies of scale. So there are obviously scale to, paying, living together, sharing housing costs, and so forth. More deeply, when it comes to the family, although this is not a discussion about value, the way economists think about children is as the main, basically, product, in a sense, of this productive unit that is marriage. And there are, there are certainly, both partners can equally share both the consumption and the production of the public good. They can equally enjoy or despair because of their children developments and achievements. And also, again, when we think about marriage, they can both invest. Both partners can invest in children as, as we saw before, how that is important. They can invest in the children human capital, and that's a very important repercussion for the future generation. Okay? There might also be some externalities and so forth. This, the risk pooling aspect has been discussed yesterday. There could also be some institutional advantages to marriages, but so I will let Casey return to this later on, because we are sharing the presentation. So for my first part of the presentation, what I want to do is that I want to put some of the facts that have been presented over and over the past yesterday and today. So I hope it's not too boring. In a more, in a longer run historical perspective, okay? And I want to say up front that these longer run historical perspectives, we are talking about the United States. Other countries historically look somewhat different, but I'm going to focus on that for today, okay? So I'll start with, I hope not to overwhelm you with graphs, but I will have 6 graphs, okay? So the first graph is represent the amount of, I'll say here because, okay. No, it's better if I say here. So in the first graph, on the horizontal axis over there, what I am plotting, unlike previous graph, is not the year, one specific calendar year, but it's the birth cohort, okay? And I'm showing you the trends for 100 centuries, basically, of marriage cohorts, going from the cohort of women born in 1870 up to the cohort of women born in the 1990s, okay? The different lines here are representing basically the fraction of women that are married at a given age, by a given age, okay? So the first takeaway from this graph is that this red line, if you see it, it has been huge declining since the cohorts of women born in the 1950s. This is the fraction of women who are married by age 20. And similarly for this blue line, which is the fraction of women who are married by age 25, okay? So the first takeaway from these slides is that there has been obviously a trend toward later marriages. However, and that's somewhat the second, if I look at the top line, which is the fraction of women who are married by age 35, then you'll see that, at the third, if we look at the last few decades, women born in the last few decades of the 19th century, almost 90% of them got married by age 35. For this cohort born in the 70s and 80s, this marriage rate is lower, but it's not substantially lower, okay, than what was observed for this cohort of women. The last thing that I want you to take away from this slide is the exceptionality, in a sense, of the cohort of women born in the 30s and 40s. Those are, when there was a trend, with the baby boom, the economic boom, as well as the baby boom after World War II, there was this age at marriage, the proportion of women married by age 20 was actually higher for women born in the 1940. So this is about 50% married by age 20 than what was the proportion for women born earlier on in the century. Okay, so this is another way of showing the same information somewhat differently. Now the top line represent the fraction, the share of women ever married at a later age, okay, by age 40 and 45, depending on the data set. And I should say that this is from the very interesting, important work by Martha Bailey and her co-author in trying to really collect consistent information on marriage rates and fertility as well over a very long period of time, okay? So here what you see is that for the cohort of women born in 1870, 1880, 1890, more or less, by age 45, okay, about 91% of them are married by age 40 or 45. And although you see this downward trend here, you have that for the cohort of women born in the late 1960s, you see that basically almost 90% of them eventually get married. So it's a postponement of marriage, but it happens. And that is similar to the statistic that we saw for the women born in 1870. The second line, the red line, basically it shows this point once again. This graph, and now the scale is the one on the left, represent average age at marriage by cohort. And you see how for the cohorts of women born from the 1870 all the way to 1910, the average age of marriage was 22 years. And then you have this drop in age of marriage. Once again, this is for the cohort of women born in the 30s and the 40s. Those are the women having children in the 50s and 1960s, so it's really the mothers, the baby boom mothers. And then you see these trends towards increasing age at marriage for the most recent cohort, okay? The last piece for the aggregate, and we have, again, this has been discussed, is, we have documented patterns of marriage. Let's talk about divorce, okay? The reason why I'm not going forward, because this graph, I think, makes an important point. This is from the work by Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers. This black line, and I hope you can see it from down there, this represents the number of divorces per 1,000 population. This is what we economists call a flow measure. So it's just the number of new divorces that occurred over the year, over the calendar year, okay? And as you see, and here we start now, this is not cohort, this is the actual calendar year. We start from 1860, okay? So once again, going much further back in time. And you see how divorces are kind of stable. You see this spike around World War II. I've not investigated, so this is interesting, but more importantly, you see this increase in the number of divorces per 100,000 population over the 70s and into the 80s, which is a period over which there was a vast change in legislation related to divorce that made it somewhat kind of easier. So from mutual consent to unilateral, this shift implied that had this effect. Is associated with an increase in divorce. Some economists have documented this is kind of a pipeline effect. So the idea is that there were certain types of marriages that perhaps were not marriages of equal, that were in trouble, let's say, and that the change the change in legislation by making it cheaper, kind of to divorce, sort of led to a massive breakup of those marriages. Okay. However, and this is what I want to say, I'm sure you cannot see this line, and there is another one over here. But if we take the trend in divorce rate, okay, from 1860 to 1945, and we extrapolate forward to today, we see that actually after this spike in divorce over the 80s, divorce rates are going back to trend, okay? Similarly, this upper graph, this is about divorces. Now we take into account the fact that there are fewer marriages, so these are divorces per 1,000 married couple in a year. Once again, you see this spike over the 70s and the 80s, but then since then, actually the flow of divorces has been declining, and it seems that it's kind of going back to this trend, okay? So, I mean, I'm not saying that this is great, but in a sense, this is a positive. I mean, I think that we see that this decline in divorces is important, and the women of the 90s, the cohort of the 90s, are starting to behave more and more like the cohort of the late 19th century. What I want to say next is that another, potential positive signal that comes from divorce is you can see it when you look at the data in the following way. Now, on the horizontal axis, so I'm going to take marriages by decade of marriage, okay? So the marriages that occurred during the 1950s, 1960s, 70s, and so forth, okay? And we will see of the first marriages that occurred over this decade, what fraction of them dissolved, by a given year of marriage, by marriage duration. And here you see that, of course, this is the cohort of marriage of the 50s. You see that this is a relatively low marriage rate. If you look at after 10 years of wedding, less than 10% of all marriages has ended in divorce. As a consequence, associated with the change in legislation, you see this increase in divorce rate up to about. This line, I don't know if you can see, but these are the 60s. This line up here is the 80s, and this line up here, so the upper line, those are the marriages that occurred over the 70s. So if you look at this graph, from the cohort of marriage that occurred in the 50s to that of the 70s, the probability of the marriage being dissolved by year 10 went up from 10% to 30%. However, since then, this is declining, okay? The red line, this red line here, this represents the probability of marriages that occurred in the 1990s of ending in divorce. And so there is a little bit of evidence here too that somewhat the new marriages that are formed have been more stable. And I don't want to say anything now about causality or for what reason, but that seems to be the evidence. Now, once again, reiterating, unfortunately, the kind of very negative outlook that we saw for marriage by education, the behavior that we see, this improvement, these gains, let me say, okay, in the stability of marriage that we see in the data are mostly for once again, for the women with high levels of education, okay? So here, what we are doing is that we are representing these two lines. This is the share of women who ever married by age 40. Down here, this line that then goes up and then down, this represents the marriage rates, ever married rate of women who are at the top of the educational distribution, okay? Whereas this line up here represents the marriage rate of women, the women that are at the bottom of the education distribution. So as you can see, it is true that over the 1880s, 1890, 1900, these cohorts, there was really a decoupling of the marriage versus education decision. Either you marry or you add an education, and part of it, we can talk about the institution, but it's not really relevant. I mean, important, I think, for the point we want to make here. At the top, instead, you see the marriage rate for women born in the 1880 to 1900, but with the lowest that are at the bottom of the education distribution. For them, we observe marriage rates of about 92%, okay? What happened is that, once again, we see this convergence over time. So over time, women with high level of education, kind of during the baby boom, they kind of catch up in terms of marriage rate to the lower level of education women. However, what has come to occur over the past couple of, for the cohorts of the 50s, 60s, and 70s still, is that what has happened is that while this green line, this is the divorce rate, the fraction of women married by age 40, of the lowest educated women, that is, for the first time in history, this is lower than what's a fraction of married women who have higher levels of educational attainment, okay? A similar picture you can see in the next graph that represents age at first marriage. So this trends toward delay in marriages that we see, which is, so now in this graph again, this is, I'm sorry, I didn't describe, this is the birth cohort, again going from cohort of women born in 1880 to cohort of women born in 1970. And these lines now represent what is the average age of a woman when she married, her first marriage, okay? So we see the fact that this line is on top of this line up here represents the average age at marriage for women with high levels of education. For the cohort of women born during the late 19th century and early, first decade of the 20th century, average age at marriage was 25, as opposed to 22 for women with the lower level of education. Once again, we see that during the baby boom, that there is, women get married earlier and more and to a greater extent. So you see a decline actually from the previous cohort in the age at marriage, and then you see that for the age at marriage climbing up again. But what is going on is that it seems that there seems to be a convergence actually. While for the past few cohorts, you see up here, you see the average age at marriage for for those with a higher level of education dropping. The average age at marriage, so women with low level of education have been increasingly postponing marriage, okay? So the final piece is now, let's see how these marriages fare in terms of stability. And so in this graph, I'm plotting only for marriages that form in the 80s, 90s, and 2000. I'm plotting, the divorce by marriage duration and education. This picture gives you, I think we saw it already in some version of it, but it really can give you a sense of how badly the lowest education marriages people are doing. So this is the fraction of marriages that end up in divorce by duration of marriages, and in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. So as you see, this is what this is for women who are high school dropout, and you see that basically it's fairly high, and basically that probability has stayed to the highest levels of divorce for marriages occurring in the 1880s. Okay. However, if you look at the bottom, you see progressively, especially if you look at here, if you look at the year 10, 7 or 8, because we cannot get up to there, you see that progressively marriages of college, of women with at least a college degree have been progressively being more stable. So the probability of them dissolving by year 8 went down from 20% for the marriages of the 1980s down to less than 10% of marriages ending in divorce for the marriages of the 2000s. So in fact, for the college educated, they look, by this year, in terms of divorce rate, they have the same divorce rate of the cohort of marriage that occurred in the 1950s. Okay, so once again, I think we show this picture shows that there is this trend towards fewer and later marriages, but there is also good news in terms of trends in the likelihood of divorce. So these marriages are more stable. However, there is this great heterogeneity by education. And this, as it has been noted yesterday, is compounded by the pattern of marriage, by whom marries whom, okay? So if you look at marriage rate, so far we have just shown that these marriages of the highest educated are more frequent and more stable. Also, people tend to marry in the same education group. Okay, so in this graph, now on the horizontal axis you have time, calendar year from 1960 to 2010. And these two lines represent measures of homogamy, that is the fraction of people who marry into their own education group, for two different grouping by education, okay? Why is that important? That is important because over this period of time, between 1960 and 2010, the education distribution has shifted considerably towards, trending towards having more education, okay? So, but whatever we think, so this down line up here, we have 5 education categories, so we are kind of counting the number of marriages to each other for women who are high school dropout, high school graduate, some college, and college. And this is instead, this red line represent the type of homogamy rate that you get if you have fewer grouping. But in any case, whatever we believe about this part, the takeaway from this slide is that more than 50% of people marry someone in their own individual educational category, and there has been a slight increase in that in sorting. Okay, so there is the discussion about inequality and increasing sorting is not so much. I mean, maybe there was an increase in sorting, though in this trend of people marrying people like them in terms of educational attainment, but it's not so much the increase in the incidence of this kind of marriage that is kind of is related to the outcome. So I'll go back to what I said at the beginning about the decrease in gains of specialization in marriage as we economists see it. So those, what has happened over this year is that over the decades that we saw, especially over the later decades, we saw a huge change in the role that women play at home and in the labor market. And I discussed, and I'm not going to go. Some, there are cultural or technological reasons that might explain that change, or episodic change. World War II, certainly by drawing women into the labor force, had an effect, somewhat of an effect on subsequent participation of married women. So, but since I think I'm almost done with the time, the only thing that I want to say before we switch over to Casey is that it's clear that the group that has increased their participation to the labor market over this period is the group of married women. So in this graph, what I'm plotting is the increase, the change in hours worked per week from 1950 to 2000 by gender marital status. So this is the change in hours work over these 50 years by married men is slightly negative. For women who are married, this triples, okay? There is a huge increase in hours of work. And these two are single men and women. But what I want to leave you with is the last slide, that even the increase in labor force participation of married women has been different by education, and in ways that kind of, I think, challenge to some extent the view that it's women working that has been, caused in some sense the divorce. Because if you look at here, this low line down here, these are women with less than a high school degree. So for them, these married women with high school degree, their participation rate went up from about 32% in 1962 up to about 40% in 2014, okay? And so participation has increased for this group of married women, but not substantially. The groups that had the most gain of all, so if you look at these lines, they are really aligned. So the very top line is women with college degree, women with some college is the middle line of those three, and the last one is women, the participation rate of married women with some years of college, okay? So again, even this increase in female participation has had a gender, an education angle, with the lower educated women actually increasing their participation much less, okay?